Welcome to the Color of Success podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Dave Liu is a 30-year veteran of Wall Street and Silicon Valley and a dabbler in Hollywood. He started his career as a Wall Street banker at Jefferies, where he rose from the entry-level analyst to the executive ranks of managing director and co-head of the digital media and internet investment banking group. He broke through the bamboo ceiling as one of the only senior executives of color in an industry dominated by white men. He worked on over $15 billion of transactions for hundreds of companies, including Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, and Yelp. He retired from Wall Street in his early 40s, which is my dream, by the way, and became a serial entrepreneur, starting 4 companies in technology, asset management, merchant banking, and media. He has been an active investor and CEO advisor to multiple companies, including 4 that have reached quote-unquote unicorn status, with valuations exceeding billions of dollars. Dave is also a perspiring artist and writer who loves to draw and write funny. He has multiple certifications in creative and satirical writing, as well as screenwriting. He publishes a career advice column called Breaking Bamboo and a cartoon series called The ABC Life. He has also written a humorous career book called The Way of the Wall Street Warrior, which will be published by Wiley in November 2021. He supports philanthropic causes for disadvantaged groups all over, serves as a board member or advisor at the University of Pennsylvania, Tau Beta Pi, and Smile Train. Net proceeds from his books will go towards charities helping children born with clefts, Asian Americans, and other disadvantaged groups. He has an MBA from Harvard and dual degrees from the Wharton School and School of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Pennsylvania. So basically, I'm going to be talking to a genius today and someone who definitely knows how to manage money. So please welcome Dave Liu. How's it going, Dave?
It's going great. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you for reaching out. I was so excited to see all the new things that you're going to present today, as well as talk about your life journey, because it is just so interesting. So starting off, I had the pleasure, we can't get too much into it yet because it's not published, but I had the honor of being one of your first readers and fans of The Way of the Wall Street Warrior. And so I guess some of the mental health things that I thought about was, okay, on Wall Street, it is brutal. Is there even the term self-care involved, and what does it look like?
Yeah, so I honestly don't think there really is such a thing on a holistic level. And I think that Wall Street is actually emblematic of many highly compensated, highly competitive industries. I've had the opportunity to work not only Wall Street, but with lots of companies across all of corporate America. Everything from consumer products to retail to entertainment to technology. And what have found is that industries where there's a lot of money at stake have a lot of similarities to Wall Street. And I think as it relates to the question of self-care, I think that Wall Street and other highly compensated industries have generally not been welcoming to people that show vulnerability. I don't think that vulnerability is actually acceptable at all levels. But what's really interesting is that it seems to be accepted and tolerated at the junior level and almost encouraged. And I think part of it is, frankly, for recruiting and attracting young professionals who have a much more broad-based view on what work should mean to them, probably than, frankly, my generation or the generation before me. And then it's curiously also accepted at the very senior level. Typically C-level execs who, frankly, have nothing really left to prove, I find show vulnerability and encourage self-care, partly to make themselves much more approachable and ultimately better leaders. So it's a really kind of a strange thing where I think for a lot of highly competitive industries, vulnerability, which ultimately I think is related to self-care, is encouraged at the junior level and is demonstrated at the very senior level. But for the big bulge of professionals kind of in the middle, I really don't see it. And when I reflect upon why that's the case, I think part of the challenge is that when you're kind of in the middle, you're really in the heat of battle, right? You're really in the heat of like trying to ascend the corporate ladder. And let's face it, the reality is that as you go up the corporate ladder, the number of opportunities declines, right? Because you don't ultimately need multiple CEOs. Most companies only have one CEO, and that cascades down through the hierarchy where maybe you only need one CEO and maybe only half a dozen VPs and only a certain number of managers. And so the number of seats available to people rising the corporate ladder decreases. However, usually the compensation and the titles and the prestige and the power grows exponentially. And so I think that part of the challenge is that if you expose your vulnerability as you are kind of in that middle bulge trying to ascend the corporate ladder, frankly, it can be used against you. And not even so much by your boss, although they're ultimately the one that has to decide whether you ascend, but really by your peers. Other people that might be competing against you for those roles may point out, look, all things being equal, I'm not as much of a basket case as the other guy. And so I think that's partly the reason why I think industries like Wall Street don't really practice self-care, at least overtly, because I think the stakes are very low when you're junior, but as you rise in the corporate ranks, the stakes get much, much higher and the ramifications get a lot higher. I think that I do know for a fact, having worked in lots of different industries, that people do practice self-care, but they're very quiet about it. They practice it behind closed doors with therapists they don't admit to have, or they engage in substance abuse, drugs, things, other coping mechanisms that help them get through a lot of the challenges and the stress of the industry. And a lot of these, frankly, addictions and uses of substance are pretty well publicized in the press. Yeah. It's you can Google executives at companies across all of America, and occasionally you read about so and so vice president or so and so director was a user of MDMA or LSD.
Yeah. I mean, you're working a lot of hours, and the stress and having to rise up the ladder, so to speak, is just so stressful. And I mean, in any organization. But I mean, you mentioned vulnerability. So could you tell me more about that? Like maybe some ways that your senior management in the past, or even your juniors that you've noticed, have really been vulnerable and it been a good thing?
Yeah, I think so. I think that when senior people that I work for or have been peers of have exposed their vulnerability. For instance, they admit that the environment is very stressful. They admit that they're having a hard time with the myth of work-life balance.
Yes.
I think what that ends up doing and I hate to say this, it is definitely self-interested by them. What it does is I think it humanizes them. It makes the people below them and their coworkers feel like, okay, this person is not a robot. This person has a soul and can at least understand what it means when they delegate 120 hours worth of work to me a week. And I'm not necessarily saying that, people will revolt against that, but I do think that having at least that exposure of vulnerability by senior people does humanize them. And then I think does cause junior people to maybe not be so upset or not feel like nobody cares. And so I think that there is a little bit of exposure of vulnerability by senior people in order to create at least some empathy between them and the junior people. And I think that frankly does work quite well. I think with junior people, what I've seen when they expose vulnerability, I think it's really more because they take a lot of the direction from the company literally. So when the company says, hey, you should talk about your feelings and be really open about
mental health day.
Yeah, or how much you hate your manager. And they go, yeah, okay, great. I'll go ahead and tell people how much I hate my manager. But I'm not necessarily sure that ultimately that's what the organization wants. But I think what the organization ultimately wants is they want people to feel that this is a place that I can be my whole self, right? Because I think ultimately, at least if you feel like you're not wearing a mask at work and you feel like you can be your whole self, then I do think that helps retention, that helps overall happiness at work, or at least reduces the unhappiness at work.
Yeah, and no pun intended with the mask, because I hope everyone's wearing a mask. But the aspect that I really wanted to ask you about is identity, because you went in really young, but just a lot of young people, even in Silicon Valley, as you know, we're here in the Bay Area, is that we have kids right out of college go into these like mid-level managerial positions, having to manage people. And I got to tell you, Dave, at 21 years old, I didn't know two about how to manage people, right? Like then I got thrown into it as well, and it's a huge learning curve. So how do new folks come in and build a corporate identity, or even their identity as a person, when there is kind of this structured process or ways that you have to kind of emulate the seniors?
So I think you have to borrow from lots of other situations and people. I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel, but one of the things that I always encourage people when they join a new firm or start a new career is don't be in a rush. So first, start off by getting the lay of the land. You know, I think so often, and I admit I was a lot like this when I was younger, is that, you know, you start a new job and you're raring to go, you have all this energy and you're like, okay, I'm here to break some glass, I'm here to make some moves, I'm here to really change things up. And I have found that something that is been really helpful for me, and for I think a lot of people, is just when you first join a company or opportunity, just observe. Like every company has a culture, and with a culture comes a roadmap. With a culture comes an org chart, but also a shadow org chart. Mm-hmm. It's really the secret trapdoors or the secret HOV lanes that get you promoted, or the people that actually have a lot of power but don't necessarily have a title. Every organization has this, and we all know that, right?
Absolutely.
We observe that in companies, and you can't really learn this unless you observe and you just stay patient and you look around and you say, oh, that's interesting. That person over there is able to get things done a lot faster than the other person over there. What are they doing differently that other person isn't doing? And so I think first and foremost, I tell people, don't try to stamp your identity on like the organization, right? You're just one cog in a machine typically. So first thing is try to understand how the machine works. What are some of the unwritten rules and the rules that govern the company? Then I think what I try to do is I try to almost create a composite. Like I try to think about what are some of the things that these people do really well. What can I borrow from them, right? So for instance, you might be in an organization where people that yell a lot and people that scream a lot and are very emotional in meetings, right? We know lots of people like that. They tend to get things done and they tend to be the loudest voice, and the organization kind of respects people like that. Whereas the people that are more quiet, you know, get trampled on, they don't necessarily get their projects funded, et cetera. And so I think first you got to kind of figure out what are the rules of the game, what do people do with this organization to move things along, to get things approved, et cetera. And then what can I borrow from that? And what is complementary with my identity, right? Like, so for instance, if let's say I'm naturally an introvert, I'm not a yeller, I like to call myself like a low heartbeat person. So I kind of beat at 50 beats a minute, you know, very steady Eddie, right? I may not be the type of person who can jump up and down on the table and yell. And so I think you've got to first figure out what fits well with you. And then over time, I think you form your own identity and you form your own view on what seems to work for you in terms of advancing your career. But that's generally, at a very high level, that's generally the advice I give people. And then it's iterate. You know, one of the things that I preach a lot is that the corporate ladder and working in any company is kind of like a game. but the rules are fluid and they're constantly changing. And so you have to adapt quickly. On Wall Street, if you're familiar at all with kind of the way it works, there's kind of multiple tiers, analyst, associate, vice president, managing director, and the skills required to move up the ladder are very different at every level. And so I like to use a metaphor, which is to get in the game, to get hired into the industry, you have to be really good at checkers. But in order to get to the top, you have to be a grandmaster at chess. So as over time, the skills you need and the game you're playing fundamentally changes. And so you need to be able to understand how to adapt yourself in order to move up that ladder and be successful.
Absolutely. And I think, and I'm not generalizing to all Asian Americans, but clearly we're Asian American and, both have worked in systems and so forth. And so there's a lot of cultural aspects where many of us are told to put our heads down, don't rock the boat, don't make waves. And so, but that clearly many times is inconsistent with what the corporate world or the organization needs. So as an Asian American male, how are you able to kind of navigate those waters when you clearly stuck out in this majority white corporate culture?
It's so first I'll say it's hard, right? And I think frankly, that's why we have this metaphor or descriptor of bamboo ceiling, right? Mm-hmm. It happens so often that an author created a term for it. But even most recently, there's a great research report done by Harvard Business School in 2018, which wasn't that long ago, where they said that Asian Americans are the least likely to be promoted of any ethnic category, right? And so the data shows that Asian Americans do encounter some form of ceiling. They encounter some type of challenge in terms of optimizing or maximizing their career path. And so I think the data shows that it is very difficult. I personally have always viewed it as the ultimate balancing act. When you think about organizations in general, you have to be viewed as a quote unquote cultural fit within organizations where the culture is defined by the majority in power. And most of the time that is white male, right? So if you have to be a cultural fit in an organization where you stick out like a sore thumb, that's already a very challenging thing because you wear your you wear the fact that you're not part of the tribe, that you may not be a cultural fit. You wear that on your face.
Yeah.
And so no matter how hard you try, you still have the face of an outsider. And for us, you're an Asian face in America. And so I think part of it is you first have to just get over it, right? You will always have an Asian face in America. And so what I tried to do at a very tactical level is I tried to think about what are those characteristics that I have that I exude through stereotypes, through model minority myths, et cetera. What are those characteristics that I can actually leverage? Because let's face it, stereotypes, bias, they're a fact of life. Like you can't change that. And I like to joke that they're part of evolutionary biology because, frankly, they're the reason why we were able, as cave people, to discern quickly whether someone was a friend or foe, right? Mm-hmm. So we have all these instinctive things, biases that are built in as part of us. And so what I try to think about are what are the ones that I can leverage that can actually help me in my career. So as an Asian American, there's some really obvious ones like, oh, everyone thinks we're really hardworking. Okay, check. That's a good one, right? Because nobody's ever going to question if I'm not around in the office on Friday afternoon, are the odds that Dave is working really hard or he's playing golf, right? I think there's a presumption that Dave's working really hard, right? There's also a presumption that, we're all good at math. Now, what does that mean?
I'm not.
That might mean that, we have a strong ability to learn. Right? We're the kind of people that, or kind of ethnic group that people generally look at and go, okay, these guys can kind of figure it out on their own. And then, related to the stereotypes, generally there's a perception that there's lower level of criminality among Asians, right? And that translates into more obedience. And you know what? As a junior person, being viewed as obedient is an advantage because no superior wants to have somebody that feels like they're going to have to need extra hand-holding. So as an Asian American working in a white male dominated industry, I thought about what are those stereotypes that I can actually use to my advantage, and then focus my energies on dispelling or diffusing those that hurt me, those that ultimately put me in this box where I'm not viewed as leadership material. I'm not viewed as someone that can manage anybody. And those are the obvious ones where, Asians are not viewed as gregarious, they're not inspirational, they're not aggressive enough, they can't inspire people. And so what I tried to do early in my career, which worked quite well, is I started thinking about it on an incremental basis. I started thinking about how do I do these things in small wins? How do I do this incrementally in low stakes scenarios where my boss and my boss's boss would be okay with me assuming more of an aggressive or leadership position? So it'd be things like in investment banking, if you're not related to revenue, then usually nobody really cares. So I would make sure that I would, when I was young, I would do things that were non-revenue generated things that somebody had to do. I kind of, the pejorative I use, I called it like the poop patrol, right? It's kind of like, okay, I volunteer for poop patrol. And it'd be things like recruiting, it'd be things like organizing rah-rah, get-togethers, things that were really about culture building, which I think Wall Street pays a lot of lip service to, but ultimately, it plays second fiddle. Cultural and morale building is kind of second fiddle to ultimately revenue generation. But I would build credibility with my senior people around like taking ownership and leadership of those things. And then as I progressed higher up in the hierarchy, I started to focus on revenue opportunities, but I would look at situations where the stakes were low. So for instance, I would go after industry subsectors or even prospects or clients that other people had already written off. They're like, let Dave can go knock himself out and try to go fishing in that pond because that pond is dry. There's no opportunity there, right? And I'll admit it's really hard work, right? You've got to prove yourself. And if that pond was overflowing with fish, there was no way as a young person I could get opportunity to fish there. So you kind of have to be very strategic about where you want to pick. And then over time, what ends up happening is that you dispel some of these stereotypes. You dispel some of these things that people think about when they see your face. They start to look at you a little differently and go, okay, you still don't have the same face as me, but I can see how you could be a leader within this organization. And so ultimately, it's a really tough balancing act. It's not easy. But one of the things that I really preach is don't try to conquer the city in one day. It's not going to happen. Try to create small wins, build momentum, kind of squirrel away those chits, along the way. And then over time, before you know it, you start to build credibility with the organization. And then when the time is right, that's when you really push on things like promotion and compensation by showing what you've been able to accomplish.
Absolutely. And I think you put it well in terms of when you come into an organization, you have doe eyes and you're like, I want to do everything. And sometimes really push to make changes when there's not a full understanding of that cultural piece within the organization. And you're talking about leveraging something that seems to be negative or, quote unquote racist to your advantage and really breaking the mold in terms of how Asian Americans can function in a corporate environment. Tell me about some of the hardest things though for you, because it's reading your book, meeting you, it's like, this guy knows what he's talking about. It's easy. He's broken, the mold, but what were some challenges that you really had to overcome either internally or externally?
Well, I've had to overcome a lot. Obviously, much like the media reports, the stories of the billion-dollar companies, and there's classic survivorship bias in the media because nobody ever writes about the 99% of entrepreneurs who fail because nobody wants to read those stories. My book is written and published by Wiley because I had a good outcome, right? But by no means was that guaranteed anywhere along the way. And I also never took anything for granted. In many ways, I like to joke that, I'm an overnight sensation after 30 years. Took a long time.
It's a long game for sure.
A long game, right? I think, part of my background was that, I was basically alone, both spiritually and mentally for most of my life. I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I endured, when I was growing up, but I was born with a pretty severe birth defect, which basically made me feel like a minority of a minority. Mm-hmm. I didn't see, frankly, anybody with the same cleft defect that I had until, frankly, many, many years later, until I was in my 20s. So you can imagine growing up in an environment where you're stared at, and I'm not talking like a favorable, like a female gaze type stare. I'm talking about like a car crash type stare, right, for your whole life. And you feel a little bit like a monster. I was frankly reminded by my mother that I was called a monster when I was growing up. And, you feel like a constant outsider. And so I actually don't look at that as a negative. In many ways, I think that gave me a superpower, which allowed me to be really successful in life. And that superpower is really what I joke is rhino skin. It gave me really, really thick skin. And, I think there's plenty talked about the need for resiliency and grit. And thick skin. I think we, as a dad, I constantly tell my kids about it, right? You need to develop thick skin. And I do fundamentally believe that's really good advice, because I think if you grow up in life and you're very sensitive or you're overly sensitive, your life is going to be pretty tough because there's plenty of things in the world to offend you. There's plenty there's plenty of people in the world that really don't care that much about offending you, right? And so growing up in the environment that I grew up in, being alone and always kind of feeling like I was by myself, I think really gave me an incredible resiliency. And so by the time I got to Wall Street and Silicon Valley, even though, I don't look like it, I think I have like thick 10-inch thick leather skin. Like it's, I was ready for anything. And, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, people don't talk about this that much, but when there's a lot of money at stake and there's a lot of lives at stake from an economic standpoint, there's a ton of stress. Oh, yeah. And people, human beings like to take stress out on each other. And so I can't even remember a day on Wall Street for 25 years where I wasn't being yelled at by somebody. It was, it might be because my boss is yelling at me, saying, hey, you're not generating enough revenue, for the firm. It could be a client of mine going, hey, you didn't IPO my company at a high enough valuation, or you didn't sell my company for a high enough value. It could be my employees who are complaining about, I'm getting underpaid, I'm not well liked, you don't love me, And so I can't remember a day where I wasn't being yelled at by somebody for 25 years. But you know what? I just view that as part of the price of working in that industry. And I'll tell you, Silicon Valley really isn't a whole lot different at the senior level. It's very similar. I think a lot of junior people in Silicon Valley don't realize it, but there are so many similarities at the senior level because so much money and so much value is at stake. And when there's a lot at stake, people take things a whole different level. And so for me, it really started right when I was born, with a massive hunking hole in my face and all the surgeries and the time in the hospital. But I really do believe that helped me get the mental fortitude that I needed in order to be successful in life.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing, is that you're also doing a lot of charitable things with children and adults that struggle with cleft. And so I actually have a friend who I reached out to because he found out through the 3D sonogram now, whatever, 4D, whatever they're doing now, not around when we were having kids, but or at least not widely used, but found out that his child will be born with cleft. And I wanted to ask on his behalf, because I said, hey, I'm interviewing Dave, like he can maybe give some maybe thoughts or advice as to how a child can kind of cope with that, as well as maybe even new parents, just to be prepared.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I'm happy to talk to your friend anytime.
Thank you.
It's a very lonely place. When my mother had me, it was a really interesting time. It was in the early 70s, and they did not, it was kind of a weird time actually. They did not give you the baby immediately for like skin to skin contact. That was not part of the technology back then. So what would happen is that I was born and then I was taken away, and my mother didn't see me, and she didn't have ultrasound back then. Ultrasound wasn't there, so she had no idea. And you can imagine the visual of what I look like. I describe it to people because there are a lot of kids that are still born with this, but it's essentially like someone shot a big hole in your face. So it looks like a bullet was taken and you have this big hole in your face. So when I actually show some of my pictures of some kids who have the same thing I have to my son, because he wanted to know what it looked like, he said it was the most horrible thing he ever saw. And so that's the visual. And my mother had no idea. And so after I was born, the doctor came in and said to my mother, "Hey, I got to tell you something. You don't need to worry, but your son was born with a bilateral cleft lip and palate." And this was in the early 70s, and my mom's obviously thinking, "What are you talking about? I don't even know what that is.
Like, what is it?" Yeah.
And what is that, right? And then she admitted to me that when she saw me, there was a whole multitude of emotions that went through her, right? Everything from blame to sadness to ultimately depression. And so I think that your friend, and even today, many parents go through this kind of shocking period where they're like, "Oh my God, like what is happening here? Why is this happening?" And a lot of parents blame themselves, right? Did I take enough folic acid? Did I drink that night? Like what happened, right? And the reality is nobody really knows, right? And then I think the next stage that comes when the baby is born is just the frightening images of their kid like going through all these surgeries. So when I was born, I basically had a huge hole and I couldn't create a vacuum, so I couldn't breastfeed. And so my mother had to feed me with a dropper for about a year and a half.
Wow.
And I just think about how amazingly hard that is. Just when I had my two boys, like what my wife had to go through with breastfeeding, and what I had to go through with like feeding a bottle. I just can't even imagine what that would be like doing with a dropper, because apparently, like I had to be fed every 1 hour and a half.
Because you wouldn't, you couldn't get enough milk if you didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the next stage is really the period of when the baby, this defenseless baby, goes through a lot of surgeries. And you're just worried, oh my God, surgery is like pretty invasive, right? They're cutting their skull and all this kind of stuff. And then I think, so that's kind of the second stage, right? And then I think the third stage, which is the longest, which is when your kid gets teased and your kid gets bullied.
I was going to ask about that because that's one thing. I mean, kids can be adults too, but kids can be really mean.
Kids are really mean. Adults are mean in a different way. So like for me, my mother reminded me of the story where I came home one day. I was really young. I think I was like 5 or 6 years old. It was the first time that I'd actually gone to school, to class, and so was surrounded by classmates. And my mother said that I came home and I was bawling. I was crying. And my dad asked me what happened. And I told him that all the other kids called me a monster. And I asked my dad, "Am I a monster?" Right? And my dad said, "Look, you're not a monster. You're better than them. You work harder than them. You're smarter than them. Like, don't ever care about what other people think of you." And what my mother said, which is, and I kind of subliminally remember it, but obviously I was too young to really remember it. She said, "I never cried after that." Like I kind of just decided in my own mind that, you know what, you're right. Like, screw these people. Like, I've got to live the life that I want to live. And if they think I'm a monster, they can go to hell, right? It doesn't matter to me. And so I think that the third stage, which is frankly the longest for the parents, is that period of how do you help your kid grow up in a world where there's going to be a lot of people teasing them. There's going to be a lot of people looking at them, calling them monster. And how do you support them? Mm-hmm. And I wish I had the answer for you. I don't have a silver bullet. I think I was really lucky. I had a fabulous mother who, loved me unconditionally. I had two siblings who, never made me feel like I wasn't just one of the guys, right? And so I think it starts with a really, really good, loving household, because as a cleft kid, that's really your only sanctuary. Yeah. Everywhere else, like everybody's staring at you like you're a human car crash. And like I said, it's not a favorable gaze. It's a gaze of kind of fear, curiosity, maybe even a little bit of what happened here? Did this guy get in a fight? Is he dangerous? Right. And so unfortunately, I think your friend has a long journey ahead. Now, part of the reason why I wrote this book, and part of the reason why I've become a lot more public just recently, is because I realize now that people like me need some form of inspiration. When I was growing up, I didn't know anybody with a cleft. I even asked my mother once, hey, does anybody have what I have? And what I wanted to know was, does anybody who has what I have, is there anybody successful? is there anybody that isn't a freak show, right? That isn't working in some dungeon somewhere, but actually was able to realize their full potential. And the only person she could come up with was an actor, American actor, Stacy Keach, who played Mike Hammer on television. And I had zero in common with this guy. And so one of my goals is really to be out there more overtly and more publicly, so that friends like your friends and other cleft kids can say, okay, here's a guy, he was born with a really severe version of what I have. And he turned out okay. Like, he was able to accomplish what he needed to accomplish. It wasn't easy. Nothing in life is really easy, but he was able to do it. And so my hope is that that's the role that I can play, in helping parents, kids with clefts, as they're trying to navigate this world.
Absolutely. And I think it is just so important that you shared your story in the book and here, because I know my friend's going to be a very loving father. And I think it's more of mentally preparing himself for that support, right? Because I don't know about you, but personally, I hurt more when my kids are hurting than if someone said bad things to me, right? And so I think there's going to have to be that balance of giving confidence, support, but also for the parents to, not self-blame and find their own support groups around it, because it can just be so tough when you see that you can't take your child's pain away.
And I'll tell you, one of the things I would encourage is, I think social media is really bad for a lot of things. I think, we're definitely in a world where it's all about the way you look online. And I think it's actually harder to grow up in a world where you're not perfect looking with social media. But one of the things on social media that I think is actually really, really helpful is these Facebook groups of other cleft parents and cleft kids. Mm-hmm. I never had that. And the outpouring of support and understanding, and just a place where you can talk to other people that know exactly how you feel is amazing. And those are the communities that I would encourage your friend to join. I'll tell you one last thing about this, which I think shows you kind of the depth at which this could really impact people's feeling for themselves and their self-confidence, their psyche, which is, I think, one of the things that people with severe facial disfigurements or obvious scars, I think one of the things that goes through all of our minds as we're growing up is, will we ever find love? Will anybody actually ever love us? And I think that fundamentally goes to the heart of the challenge, because when you're growing up, particularly, in high school, middle school, when everyone's teasing you, you don't feel like anybody could ever, find affection or want to be with someone like you. Like zero.
And it's already a hard time to go to high school for anybody and like find out who you are and having people judge you and all that stuff. And the good news is you have found love. So tell me a little bit about it, because, you've been in a long, hopefully wonderful marriage and have kids. So how did that come about, and how did you balance this demanding career with finding a life partner?
Yeah, so my wife and I have a really funny story, interesting story. So I've actually known her since I was 5 years old. We both went to school in Hong Kong, and we rode the bus together for more than 10 years. I like to joke that we were frenemies. She was very competitive. She'd always want to know how I did in this exam or that exam. And I would humor her. But it was interesting, kind of a side story on this. When I started dating her, because she had been such a big part of our lives growing up, like all my siblings knew her. And so I remember calling my brother Victor, and I'm saying, "Hey, Vic, you'll never guess who I'm dating." And I told him it was my wife, Loren. And he said, "You mean that annoying girl on the bus?" Yeah, that's her. So we grew up together, and then when I went to the U.S. to study, she went to Canada. So we lost touch for 10 years. And then when I was at Harvard, she was at MIT, and I took a class at MIT. And then we started hanging out, and then one thing led to another, and then ultimately we obviously got married. But what's really interesting, I think, about our relationship is that we share the same cultural roots. So. She is a CBC, Canadian-born Chinese, and I'm ABC, American-born Chinese, and we both were transplanted back into Asia, early in our lives. So we grew up in a world where, frankly, we had the face of the majority.
Right.
We weren't second-class citizens in any way, and then we both came back to the United States to pursue college and to work. So in many ways, we had the exact same upbringing in terms of culture, kind of Confucian values mixed with North American values as well. And I think that underlying foundation has really served us really well. I also think that one of the things that's worked really well for us is that, I have a philosophy, which is that I don't think you should rely on your partner to fill any holes in your life. I think that if you rely on your partner to, I think the cliche is to make yourself whole. I think that's where you can get in trouble, because I do think that over time people change, and I think people's priorities change. And if you're looking for your life partner to fill some hole in you, then inevitably at some point they're not going to be able to do that. And so what's worked really well for us is that we both feel very strongly that we've earned the right to lead the lives that we want. And so I don't force her to do anything that I know she doesn't like to do, and she doesn't force me to do anything that I don't like to do. As an example, I actually like, going out, having fun, watching the Warriors games, going to parties, things like that. And she doesn't like any of that at all. But I never force her to come, because I know it's just going to make her miserable. And I frankly don't care what other people think when they wonder, hey, how come Dave's wife never comes to these things?
She's doing her own thing.
She's doing her own thing.
Exactly.
And then for her, she loves e-gaming. So she's got a follower network on Twitch. She loves gaming, and that's her thing. And she's got her posse of like 20-year-old Asian boys who like follow her, and they follow each other when they're doing different fights, and so that's what she loves. And so I don't try to, get involved in any of that stuff, and I let her do whatever she wants. So I think part of the secret for us, at least in terms of having a healthy marriage, is I think we have very similar kind of foundation from a cultural standpoint. We believe in the same things, the way we want to raise our kids, the way our commitment to, like, for instance, Chinese language. We put our kids in Chinese immersion. That's something that we feel really strongly about. and then in terms of like our own interests, there's clearly overlap in things that we both like, like food and travel and things like that. But there's a lot of things that we both do kind of separately, and we don't try to like impose upon each other like, oh, well, you really need to come to this because you're my wife, or you really need to do this because you're my husband. We don't do that at all. And so I think that's a big part of the reason why our marriage has been successful.
Yeah, I've been with my husband for 21 years now, and I definitely think that I really encourage even clients that love and a marriage is really about two people having their own identity that actually come together. Because if you are basing your identity on your partner, that it can become very toxic. And so I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying, and especially still having shared interests and at the same time not becoming threatened when you aren't included, or your partner and you just don't have that same interest. But I think that's amazing, particularly since you're both successful in your own right. So how did it work when you started working those 120-hour weeks? Like, how were you even able to bond during that time?
So so my wife was worked on Wall Street, venture capital, and management consulting. And so if anybody knows what it's like to work in a highly compensated, highly stressful, highly demanding industry, she knows. And I think that, so first off, she knew what I was going through. She also has the same philosophy of work-life balance that I do, which is we both think it's a sham. We don't think it exists. I think it exists if you want to have a modest career and you're fine, doing whatever you're doing. But if you really want to make it to the top, if you really want to be highly compensated, you want to be super successful, you have to recognize that there's a lot of people who want that too. And ultimately, to win, you have to play the winner's curse. You have to play the game where you have to irrationally sacrifice more than others to win. And so we both believe that the work-life balance doesn't exist for us. And what does exist is a work-life trade-off. And for both of us, what we decided was that we would focus in our 20s and 30s on maximizing earnings, maximizing our career, maximizing our full potential. And if that meant that Dave would have to be in Beijing one day, London the next day, Hong Kong the next day, New York the next day, because he's chasing the next deal, then that's the way it has to happen. And the same thing with my wife. Like, she was a hedge fund investor. Like, if she has to meet, all these companies, either in their office or on the road, if she has to spend late nights in the office to model whether she's going to take a position in a stock or not, like I totally understood that. And so what we both decided early on, and I like to think that we kind of calculated this, but I think this was more just kind of as we were going along, we both were really committed to our careers in our 20s and 30s. But then as we got closer and closer to a point where we knew that we could retire because we've been working so damn hard for so long, we decided, you know what, I think now's the time that we should start thinking about having a family. And so we had our two boys in our late 30s. So right before kind of that proverbial window closed. But then when we had our second kid, that was a time when we both decided that, you know what, we've worked our tail off for our whole lives here. Now's the time for the pendulum to swing the other way. So let's go from the work-life trade-off where work was winning to a point where now life is going to win. And so we both decided to leave our careers. And she left her career in her early 40s. For me, I did basically the same thing, but unlike her job, like my job, it took me a lot longer to extract myself. When you've been in the firm for as long as I have, leaving a Wall Street firm is a little bit like leaving the mafia. You don't leave the mafia leaves you. So even though I told my firm when I turned 40 that I wanted to leave, their first reaction was like, "Wait a minute, how long have you been here?" I've been here 20 years. When I told them I wanted to leave when I turned 40, it still took another 3 years for me to fully extract myself. but I did that so that I could be home for my kids. I could be there when my kids are, eating. I could put them to bed, and not become, frankly, the cliche, right? The absentee dad that doesn't know his kids, and one day, he comes home and the kids have left for college.
Right.
And the wife's hanging out with Gardner, right? Like,
well, yours would be with the gamer boys.
Yeah, exactly.
The 20-year-olds.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I don't talk to Wall Street experts, on the daily. So I have you here. I mean, millennials, Gen Zers, they're always talking about how they're burnt out and, they want to retire early. Obviously, I joke all the time at my job, like I'd like to retire by 40. There's so many investment vehicles out there with cryptocurrency, NFTs, stocks, all that stuff. And so what do you think is maybe the best way for these generations to actually accumulate wealth, or at least what sacrifices do you think it takes at this point in time?
So if your question is how would I build wealth in 2021, I think the nice thing is that I think there's two main ways to do it now. Whereas for me, I think there was only one way. And I think the main way, which is the way I did it, okay, is first off, you got to live within your means. You've got to understand that it doesn't matter how much money you make, it's how
Absolutely.
much money you spend. There's plenty of research by lots of behavioral economists like Danny Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, that prove that you only really need about $90,000 a year to be happy. So it doesn't take a ton of money to be happy. But what matters is what you spend on. So when I became an MD, so managing director, which is kind of the highest level from a deal investment banking standpoint, I stayed in the same house, same neighborhood that I was in when I was a vice president. I didn't move, and most MDs do. Most MDs go, oh, I'm a big MD now. I'm going to go move to the most expensive neighborhood, in Silicon Valley. And I also didn't buy a new car. Most of my colleagues were driving, 7 Series BMWs or Ferraris or whatnot, and I was still driving the car that I loved, in my early 30s, which was my rice rocket, the Honda S2000, which listeners will appreciate because it was like the epitome of rice rocket. But I could easily have upgraded to a better car, but I decided, look, I want to be able to exit stage right, and I want to make sure I have enough money in the bank so that I can do whatever I want. So my first piece of advice is really control your spend. Like, don't let lifestyle creep up on you, and then you're out of control. I think the second thing related to that is that there's actually a lot of sophistication around tax advantage vehicles that I think a lot of people don't really exploit. Everything from IRAs to 401ks to Roth IRAs, these are really powerful, retirement mechanisms. And so always put your money into those things first before you put it in some CD or something that's not earning anything. And then I think in terms of yourself, okay, I think that there's really this concept that I love, which I preach about, and as you know in my book, which is about being a scarce commodity. So being unis, which is the Latin word for one and only. And what that means is that think about how to make yourself not just one of thousands of resources, not just another person somebody can hire or fire, but try to build skills, try to be someone that's truly unique in some fashion. And if you build skills in an area that you're pretty good at, and it overlaps with what society values, that's how you can build wealth. And so for me, for instance, what I did was I made sure that I knew how to do certain types of transactions in certain types of subsector industries that were really complicated. And that made me kind of an expert in a certain area. And that model of trying to be unique with a certain skill set and then getting paid for it and building wealth and then building fame and power, like that's a very traditional route. Like I need to be good at something. Either I get, a degree in it or apprenticeship in it, and then I build wealth in it, and then I have fame and power, right? That's kind of like the traditional trajectory. But the second way I think people can build value today is actually you reverse that. And I think that didn't exist in my time. Like you couldn't be famous for fame's sake and then leverage that to build wealth. You have to kind of build wealth first, or be good for something, known for something specific, and then build fame and power after that. And so I think that we're in a really interesting world now where there are a lot of people that have huge followings, are really well known. But and I'm not trying to disparage it. In fact, I actually admire this. When you actually look at what they have done or their background, it doesn't feel like it's from the traditional school that I came from, right? They didn't go to Harvard and become an expert in this specific field and then work at the best firm and then built a following because of the world expert. A lot of times, like they might have been somebody doing something else. And then they said, I stumbled upon this one area that I think is kind of neat. I'll do a whole bunch of TikTok videos. I'll build a bunch of following because I'm funny. And then I'll leverage my fame in other ways by getting a show, a merchandising product, etc. So I think today there's actually a lot of different ways to build wealth. And it really just comes down to like, where can you be really great? Like I like to joke, like if you look at investment banking, can you be a really good investment banker? Or could you be a really good person playing an investment banker on TV? Both are really viable, right? But in my day, you couldn't make money playing an investment banker on TV. That wasn't an option. But I think today you can. And so yeah. I would encourage, people that are trying to think about how do I build value for myself in this world. I would think like there's actually a lot more options now. And those are kind of just two very stark differences, but I think they're both viable alternatives because I've seen people do it that way.
Absolutely. And we're talking during the opening weekend of Shang-Chi and having all that, all the Asian representation out there at premieres and buying out theaters and stuff like that to support, moving the community forward and elevating the representation. And so I think what you're saying, hopefully that continues to happen so that there are opportunities to make those decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I'm a big proponent of is more representation of our faces and our voices in the media. I was actually part of the initial dinner with John Chu at Chef Chu's, where we went around the table and we all sponsored buyouts for Crazy Rich Asians. Mm-hmm. And I think the media kind of made it more mythical than it really was, but it really was just that. It was, a bunch of us around the table talking about how it's really important that this movie does well, mm-hmm. because there's a whole bunch of other movies that will either get greenlit or killed with Asian leads if this movie doesn't do well. And a bunch of us looking around the table and you're like, look, at the end of the day, what is the one thing that we all kind of have in common? A lot of us have the financial wherewithal to put our money where our mouth is. Mm-hmm. And so that really was the first major gold open, if you will. Yep. I know that there were a few others, but that was really the first big one. And the founders of Gold House have done a great job of institutionalizing that and obviously making it a part of the fabric of sponsorship of Asian American media. But I'm a big believer in that. I've supported both financially and as an advisor production companies in Hollywood with Asian American founders and producers. I've done the same on Broadway with one of the top Asian American producers on Broadway. And so I'm a big believer in getting more of our voice out there because I'm really worried about the long-term future for people that look like us in this country. Yes. Particularly when politicians love to polarize us and use us as the face of the enemy. And so if we are constantly viewed as Asian American and not American, then I think we're in trouble. And so Absolutely. I think the more that we can be viewed as just another American, a regular good old American, I think the better. And I think that comes from media. And so in many ways, that's why I wrote my book. It's why I do these little side projects like this cartoon strip that I do, because there are really no cartoon strips about the Asian American household. I mean, it's kind of shocking, but there are none. And so I said, you know what? I got a lot of funny stories to tell, a lot of which my kids say to me. And so in my free time, why don't I just draw some of this up? And that's really how the ABC Life came about. It's because I wanted to kind of tell stories and show, frankly, non-Asian people that, we're just kind of like you. We have the same kids who say crazy stuff to us too, as well. So I think that's a big part of what I focus on as well, and just more representation in the media.
Yeah. And especially for our children, we need the world to be better. And I think that adds that extra stake there, because I just don't want them to continue being discriminated against. I'm not saying it'll go away ever, but I think just trying to make it as safe as possible, as welcoming as possible to be an Asian American female, right? Because there's other things that intersect with gender as well. We are talking about Wall Street, and I'm sure your wife has tons of stories that she'd love to tell too about, going through that environment as a woman. And what I really liked about in your book is saying, I can't speak to that because I haven't been there, but I can just relay some information that I've learned from other people, which was a really nice way to say it, as opposed to kind of mansplaining. So thank you for doing that. What do you feel is the importance of giving back in these ways, like to increase representation, to help children that are struggling, even from birth? It seems like a very simplistic question, but not all people are donating their extra funds to have gold openings and things like that. Why is it important to you?
Well, I think it comes down to where do you feel your role is in this universe, and who do you feel you owe any gratitude to, and who do you feel you should pay it forward to? And I think that there are definitely a lot of people who feel they don't owe anybody anything. I don't happen to be that person. I think despite everything that's happened to me, being born the way I was born, being in poverty, being Asian American in America, like I know I'm one of the luckiest guys on this planet. And I just think about small things like, just timing. Like if I was born even 50 years before when I was born, I would not be alive. The technology wouldn't exist, right? But, starting all the way back from that first caveman or cave person who invented fire to the doctor who knew how to do craniofacial reconstruction, right? There's a whole cascade of events that happened over human history that led to this point that helped me. And so I do believe fundamentally that we have an obligation to help others if we have the wherewithal. And I have that wherewithal. I have the time. I have a lot of knowledge in my head that I can share. And so I just fundamentally believe in my fiber that I personally have an obligation to give back. And it's not just driven by my obligation. It actually does make me feel good. So I think there are a lot of people who I think should consider giving and helping. One, because I think you owe it to humanity to do that. But second, even if you don't feel you owe it to anybody, I think most of us feel good by doing good. And so even if you're purely self-interested, wouldn't you want to help somebody somewhere? Right?
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope people
so.
would have that. Yeah.
So that's why I think we need to do that. And the only way we advance and make the world better for everybody is if we do this. I think if we were all selfish and self-interested, I don't believe that we would advance, and I don't think the place would improve. And so that's why I really firmly believe strongly in it. And I think that it's also a way to ultimately achieve happiness. There's a lot of books, a lot of research about what defines happiness, how do people be happy. And for me, one of the stories and the studies that I spent a lot of time analyzing was the Grant study, which was a longitudinal study done by Harvard, where they analyzed the lives of a Harvard graduate class over a long period of time. And that included, JFK, John F. Kennedy, and a variety of other very successful people. And what was interesting is that after studying their lives over decades, the one consistent thing that they found that drove happiness was the strength of strong, enduring relationships towards the end of one's life. Mm-hmm. And so I always thought about that deeply. It wasn't money, it wasn't fame, it wasn't power. It was the power and the enduring relationships that one has towards the end of one's life. And so for me, I think a lot of that comes from giving back and helping people and feeling good about not just other people, but feeling good about yourself. Because if you can't love yourself, I don't know how you can love anybody else.
Well, and that's a tremendous value that you can continue to aspire to. And I tell clients all the time, there's goals and then there's values being aspirational. And I think if that is the value, which I think there's two types of currency, as you alluded to in my mind anyways, relationships and money. And the point is, when I tell people, when I'm working with them, really approach things from a relationship focus, in that when you're doing something to not screw someone over, and would you act differently if someone was coming at you and you wanted to preserve the relationship? I'm not saying be like not telling people to get out of your face if it's toxic or anything, but if they offend you, is it really worth the relationship to confront them? Sometimes yes, many times, you may have to find a different way around it. So I really think that value hopefully could be put out there more, and people can kind of internalize that. And also, as you mentioned, it's very important when you're building deals and, working with people for years and years. I mean, there may be really difficult personalities out there, but somehow a lot of people can unlock ways to get what needs to be done by building relationships with those folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know this because you read my book, but there's a philosophy that a very senior mentor of mine, who was a mentor to Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan. And my mentor, he told me, like, you only have friends and very good friends on Wall Street. And the reality is, like, nobody ever does business if they have to and have a choice. They don't do business with enemies. They don't give business to people they don't like. And if you're ultimately in the business of maximizing your career, there is zero upside to people feeling that you're their enemy. And look, you don't necessarily have to like them, but you don't have to go out of your way to stick it to them. And so I believe firmly in the power of relationships. And like I said, even if you're completely self-interested, doing good, making you feel good, should be something you should have high on your priority list.
Well, I couldn't have put it better. Is there any other imparting message, where can people buy the book, learn even more about you?
Yeah, so I'm pretty transparent online. So you can learn all about me on my website, lucrative.com, which is LIU. It's a play on my name.
I loved it.
Yeah, I just try to do whatever, frankly, I like to do. So that's why I focus on lucrative things, not necessarily lucrative from a money standpoint. So you can go on my website and learn more about me. And then you can also pre-order my book on there if you like. The book comes out in November by Wiley. And as I mentioned earlier, 100% of the net proceeds will go to charity. They'll go primarily to Smile Train, which is a charity focused on doing cleft repair for kids. They have a fabulous business model. They are able to do surgeries that would normally cost like kids like me in America, $20,000 to $30,000. They're able to do it in other countries for $250. So
wow.
Just an amazing business model. So I'm donating net proceeds of the book to them, as well as Asian American charities that focus on stopping Asian hate, as well as getting more Asian faces and voices in media. So very narrowly focused on charities that are really important to me, but ones that I think I can be impactful with.
Absolutely. And I'm just so glad. I was so surprised when I got your email and I was like, wow, this guy's amazing. And I'm just so glad that you reached out, because this means so much to me and will mean so much to people listening, to know that you have broken the quote unquote bamboo ceiling and continue to give back, because you know how important it is.
I really think that if I were to really boil it down into like a succinct message, I think that for Asian Americans, there are really two things that we all need to be focused on. One is we've got to get in more leadership positions in corporate America. Unfortunately, I wish all of us could be founders of big companies, but the vast majority of us are still going to work in companies. And we've got to get through the ceiling, and we've got to get in the positions of power. And I think things like my book can help you a little bit in doing that. But at the end of the day, it's really up to you to kind of figure out how to navigate your own specific company. And then second, we've got to get more voices and faces in the media. We have to. We've got to do that. Time is not on our side, as China continues to become more and more the boogeyman for American politics. And so those are two areas I think all of us can spend more time really focused on to help Asian Americans across this country.
Absolutely. And thank you for doing this on the podcast, because I think this is just such a powerful way to get your name, your face out there to even a different segment or group of listeners. And I think there's people really chomping at the bit to find a way to give back and be involved in a way that's meaningful to them.
Yeah, that's great. I love sharing hopefully positive messages, and I hope your audience interprets my message as one of hope and trying to help make the world just a little bit better for other generations, even if you're not Asian American, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that I really do believe this, even though this is self-serving. I really do believe that Asian Americans represent the best of America. I think that there's so many things about the model minority myth that are true. I think that and I think it's all the positive ones. Like, I really do think we work really hard. We try to pay our taxes. We try to do the right thing, right? And I just don't think that it's fair for us to be victimized, to be marginalized, to frankly not even be considered, not be viewed as kind of a forgotten minority.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just hoping to advance the cause in some small way, and I hope others will as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Dave. I really appreciate you, and I'm sure there'll be many years of fun discussions together.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to the Color Success Podcast. Listen, like, subscribe on all major streaming platforms, YouTube, IG, and if you want exclusive content, you can join our Patreon. All links can be found at colorofsuccesspodcast.com.